BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? In this episode, I will be responding to the book The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones. And you can see from the title here that this is listed as full presentation. However, last week on the channel, I did a part 1 to the book discussion on the London of Jack the Ripper. But the reason why this one is called full presentation is because it's going to talk about the activities of Jack the Ripper during the Autumn of Terror in 1888, whereas part 1 mostly talked about the events that led up to Jack the Ripper's crime spree, such as Israel Lipsky and the murder of Miriam Angel and the suspicious death of Annie Millwood, who is a possible Jack the Ripper victim. So this one is going to focus on some of the more famous crimes that have been attributed to Jack the Ripper. And I would invite you to go back and listen to part 1 at some point in the future if you are curious, but I always want these multi-part discussions to exist as standalone episodes where people can jump in at any point. And again, full credit goes to Richard Jones, the author of this text, and there's a request in the book that the photos and material not be shared without his permission, so I'm not going to be using the direct screenshots from the book in this one. But if you do want to read this book, The London of Jack the Ripper, it is a very easy read, and I think it's because of the arrangement. There are lots of photographs. It's also divided into 2 columns on each page, and you can download it online for free. One more time, The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones. And I'm somebody who just reads a little bit more easily on electronic screens as opposed to paperback books. So this presentation, though, was very eye-catching and it really pulls you in, but it's also very graphic because not only does he share the famous photos of the Jack the Ripper victims, but there are full-body images of the women who were mutilated by Jack the Ripper. We're talking about mortuary photos. Very, very graphic, though, just providing the disclaimer. But if we want to look at Jack the Ripper's reign of terror in 1888, first I would like to begin with one of the crimes that preceded the Ripper, and that is the murder of Martha Tabram. Now, there's one person who followed the Jack the Ripper case and talked a lot about it, named Walter Dew. And Walter Dew was an inspector who was perhaps more famous for the Dr. Crippen case, but he was also one of the few people who believed that the murder of Emma Smith in the spring of 1888 was Jack the Ripper. But what Richard Jones talks about in The London of Jack the Ripper is that Walter Dew said even more strongly that okay, maybe not everyone would be convinced that Emma Smith was murdered by Jack the Ripper. She talked about how she was attacked by multiple men and she was assaulted in a very different way. But then almost certainly Martha Tabram was murdered by Jack the Ripper. She's the woman who was stabbed 39 times and found dead outside in the summer of 1888. And I think that there are an enormous amount of strong points that would indicate that Martha Tabram was indeed murdered by Jack the Ripper. In a previous episode, I said that there's about an 80% chance, but it's an optimistic 80% chance, meaning that I'm not completely convinced. But I think at the end of the day, we'll most likely find out that the same killer committed the murder of Martha Tabram and the 5 canonical Ripper victims. And if I understand what Richard Jones thinks as well, he is either of the belief that the Ripper murdered Martha Tabram, or that there's a very strong possibility, maybe something like what I said, heavily leaning that way, and thinking that more likely than not she was murdered by Jack the Ripper. But I think adding that quotation from Walter Dew is actually a disservice to the theory, because that just goes to show that Walter Dew was pattern seeking to get a desired result. It's almost as if this guy was just jumping to conclusions about anything. Oh yes, the murder of Emma Smith, the murder of Martha Tabram, oh yeah, it's all connected. But it's only really in his own mind, because, as I said, it's almost far out to think that Emma Smith was actually killed by the Ripper. And I mean, there are just so many differences, let alone that she wasn't even murdered on site. She was able to walk back to her lodging house and then went to a hospital. And the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, and then also Martha Tabram, were not in any such condition. Absolutely not. And they were all murdered on the spot, and their bodies stayed on the spot, let alone the fact that Emma Smith said multiple men attacked her, and she was, as I said already, assaulted in a very different way. But I still think at the end of the day, we'll probably find out that the same killer murdered Martha Tabram that committed the other crimes. Now, this is where I'm going to introduce a particular suspect into the mix, and he isn't named exactly in the book during this discussion, but it's bringing up the question of how was Jack the Ripper able to commit these crimes, and I wanted to look at the suspect Aaron Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski is the prime suspect in some people's minds, and on a previous Ripper Wednesday, I was responding to some of you guys in the comment section. Multiple people said that they thought that Aaron Kosminski was a bad Jack the Ripper suspect because it was reported that he had a phobia of bathing, and that the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper wouldn't even have let him get close to them. Well, this material is discussed in the book The London of Jack the Ripper because it states that one way that the Ripper may have been able to murder some of the victims was by wearing a very soft shoe, such as a slipper, or maybe even something lighter than that, almost. And you can just use your imagination. That's kind of the way that it's put in the book, but even something softer than a slipper. So he's not making any sounds with his footsteps. And with certain victims, he is just approaching them and murdering them without saying a word. So this whole thing about how he had to engage in conversation or do something to lure the woman close to him might not even have taken place. So this guy, even if he's some type of sloppy mess, the way that some people believe that Aaron Kosminski was, he still could have attacked at least 3 of the victims, those being Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, and Catherine Eddowes. Now, with the murder of Liz Stride, she is seen talking to someone who quite possibly could have been the Ripper, and I'll talk about that in a second. And with the murder of Mary Kelly, she was murdered indoors and mutilated indoors, so that doesn't really quite fit into that theory, so I know that it's not the most fruitful discussion, but I might have to put that into the box of question marks. Well, is that really what happened with Aaron Kosminski if he were indeed Jack the Ripper? But I would like to talk about a different Jack the Ripper suspect, and his name is Charles Lechmere, because he is named in the book. Although he's referred to as the alias he used, he is just called Charles Cross in The London of Jack the Ripper. And the discussions about Charles Cross relate, of course, to the murder of Polly Nichols. And I've said for a very long time that I think he's a very strong suspect for the murder of Polly Nichols, the first confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper, because he is the first witness to see her body. And based on all of the reconstructions, it seems that he was standing before her body before the second witness, Robert Paul, walked up and saw him there. But this is the London of Jack the Ripper, and it's just asking the question, how was Jack the Ripper able to get away with these crimes? Because after the murder of Martha Tabram, there was almost like a vigilance committee that was formed. There was a meeting that took place, and it says that even 70 men attended this meeting. This is all in the London of Jack the Ripper, and that these men almost went on their own types of patrols and lookouts. And then after the murder of Polly Nichols, law enforcement has stepped up their game as well to be out on the street because they realized that it's quite likely that a serial predator was on the loose, or at the very least, murderous individuals would have been roaming about, even if there were different killers between the murders of Martha Tabram and the murder of Polly Nichols. All right, well, things are dangerous now, so they need more people out and about. But how was Jack the Ripper able to avoid all of the policemen that were on the street, all the PCs, as well as just people that are members of vigilance committees, because the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee would also become a very important role in Jack the Ripper's story with the From Hell letter, which I'll talk about in a second. And one possibility is that Jack the Ripper was Charles Lechmere. I also think that he is a strong suspect. I put him in my top 4 suspects of being most likely to be Jack the Ripper. And one of the ways that he could have avoided, well, all of these obstacles that the Ripper would have faced would have been simply by just standing over the footsteps of Polly Nichols, meaning that he committed the murder, he heard Robert Paul approaching, and he just stood there in place as opposed to trying to run and flee the scene. Now, that is hardly something that you could bring into a court of law, but people have approached the theory in other ways. He heard the footsteps coming, so he did some things to alter his appearance. What it really just would have been that committing the murder without an overcoat on and without a pair of gloves, because this would have been in the early AM hours, even though it is August 31st of 1888. So by removing the overcoat and the gloves, then whatever blood that would have been on him could have been concealed. And in the London of Jack the Ripper, this question is also asked. How was the Ripper able to mutilate women without having enough blood on him to be noticed by somebody? And the overcoat theory isn't discussed in the book, but what it states is that it wouldn't have been extremely abnormal for somebody to be walking about Whitechapel with blood on an apron, so to speak. I mean, there are slaughterhouses and butchers and let alone countless other professions that would possibly have some type of excuse for having blood on the clothes in the early AM hours. Even the midwife theory that Jack the Ripper was a woman, the Jill the Ripper theory. I mean, there are explanations as to how and why someone could have had blood on them when they're walking about in Whitechapel. But I will challenge that part of the book by saying that even though it's not something that Richard Jones is taking to the bank and saying absolutely certainly this is what happened, I think that that's less likely, because I think that the overcoat theory is much more likely that Jack the Ripper could have removed his overcoat, committed the murders, and put the overcoat on, because the murders of Martha Taberman and Polly Nichols were, again, widely discussed, widely reported upon. There was an inquest, and these were things that were talked about in the newspapers very frequently, or lots of people knew about them. And based on the amount of media coverage, as well as people talking about the murder of Polly Nichols, I mean, the fact that nobody saw any type of suspicious individual that actually was the killer running from the scene wearing clothes that were covered in blood, that just goes to show that maybe that's not exactly what happened. And there are maybe three possibilities. One of them is that the killer was Charles Lechmere and that he murdered her and then he just stood in place. That's the explanation for the first crime. The second one is that Jack the Ripper was extremely familiar with the streets of London and the back alleys, and extremely familiar with Whitechapel, and he knew how to sneak around without being noticed by people, as well as for the simple fact that he's just listening for noises, and if he hears footsteps coming, he's going to hide in the shadows. Again, this is all happening in the early AM hours, so that would have been reasonably possible, even if the sun is just about to come up. I mean, if it's not total darkness and pitch black, he still could have hid in the shadows relatively easily, so says me. Now, I mean, if Jack the Ripper was not Charles Lechmere or Aaron Kosminski, it does seem like he was somebody who was extremely familiar with the streets of London. And the third one is that he just got lucky and nobody noticed him. Those are, as I said, those are the three possibilities. So, I mean, I definitely think that maybe the first two are a little bit stronger, but I've also noticed that there are certain aspects of the Ripper story that actually indicate that there is a single perpetrator who is responsible for these crimes. For a very long time, I was leaning toward the multiple killers theory, and I did the same thing with the Zodiac Killer, even to the point where I'm beginning to wonder how much of people's individual personalities get affected by these, or how much someone's theory gets affected by their individual personality. Like, how do personality traits affect a true crime hypothesis? Because let's look at some of the evidence that is discussed in the book, The London of Jack the Ripper, in favor of there being a single killer. And this goes to Jack the Ripper's third crime, the murder of Liz Stride, where a witness is actually possibly looking at Jack the Ripper, and it's not just, well, maybe there's this suspicious guy standing around. No, he's seeing somebody who quite likely was the murderer of Jack the Ripper's third victim, Liz Stride, and again, they have some type of extended interaction, so that whole thing about blindsiding women without any previous interaction doesn't appear to be true for the murder of Liz Stride. And then that gets to a point where Israel Schwartz is like possibly actually looking at Jack the Ripper. Now, we're not 100% sure if Israel Schwartz saw Jack the Ripper, but he is perhaps the strongest witness. He estimated that the killer was about 5 feet 5 inches tall, fair complexion, but with a mustache, and also he was about 30 years old. And this is something that becomes very consistent throughout the Ripper case. A lot of people are estimating that Jack the Ripper was around 30 years of age. And there's even some other witness accounts that are discussed after the murder of Mary Kelly, because some people are just saying that they saw this man in the area. And one of them was, she was also named Annie. She lived in Miller's Court at 5 Miller's Court, and her name has just escaped me, but she reported that she saw a man that she thought was 5 feet 5 inches tall and around 30 years old. Then we have the more famous testimony of George Hutchinson, who says that he saw a man with Mary Kelly who was 5 feet 6 inches tall and approximately 35 or 36 years old. And Okay, 30 years old, 35 years old. We're talking about somebody on the earlier side of 30s, early to mid 30s. All of that is consistent. And you might be thinking, well, 5 feet 5 inches tall, is that just some type of average height? Doesn't matter. That is a consistent sighting among the witnesses that I have observed, where it just appears that there is evidence to indicate that they are all looking at the same person. And a lot of the Jack the Ripper story boils down to the testimony of this individual, George Hutchinson, because he has recalled an enormous amount of detail. And I mean, I think there's even a line in the book, The London of Jack the Ripper, that states that, all right, well, it just comes down to the fact, do you believe George Hutchinson or not? Because some people are proposing Jack the Ripper suspects who are very poor, who would have been extremely disheveled. How about, like I said, Aaron Kosminski, immigrant from Poland, a barber who's mostly unemployed, goes on to eat food out of the gutter, and is afraid to take a bath. And George Hutchinson is reporting that he has witnessed Murray Kelly with a reasonably well-dressed man who has a horseshoe pin and a bunch of other things that stand out. And I mean, that definitely doesn't sound like he saw Aaron Kosminski. But I've said in some previous episodes that I think that George Hutchinson is mostly a liar. So, I mean, you really just have to determine whose side are you going to be taking in all of this. So the point is that Jack the Ripper, if it were dealing with a single killer, could have been somebody who was a Caucasian male, around 30 years old, around 5 feet 5 inches tall, very familiar with London, not somebody who was just passing through, like these things about how, oh, well, maybe he was a sailor who was just in and out of the area at the time. I mean, multiple Jack the Ripper suspects are sailors, and that's just their explanation that he's some guy from a foreign country who wasn't there that long. If there is a single killer, and it wasn't Charles Lechmere, then it could be that there was a very strong amount of familiarity, someone who knew how to weave in and out of the back alleys of London. And another example of this is the murder of Liz Stride, where you have Louis Deemschutz riding his horse and pony down the street, and an explanation has been provided by Richard Jones in the book as to what may have happened, because there's an individual out there named Randy Williams who wrote the book Sherlock Holmes in the Autumn of Terror, and he talks about his theory with the murder of Liz Stride, and that is that Louis Deemschutz is riding down the street in his horse and buggy, and the pony gets startled by the scent of blood. The pony shied at the scent of blood. And what Randy Williams said very strongly is that he works with horses, he works on a horse farm in Pennsylvania, and horses do not shy at the scent of blood. He spent a lot of time around them. And then he immediately began to think that there was something suspicious about Deemschutz's story, and more or less Louis Deemschutz went on to become the suspect of Randy Williams. Now here is something that is discussed in the book The London of Jack the Ripper. What if the scent of blood didn't make the pony go a little bit off? What if the scent of blood wasn't the trigger? What if the pony heard something or possibly saw something? I really doubt it would be anything visual because, I mean, well, let's just say that the pony could have had blinders on as they were traditionally done. And even if the pony didn't, it would have been very dark. But some type of noise might have startled the pony, or some type of behavior on the part of the Ripper could have startled him to the point where he just backs off and hides into the shadows, and then again he waits for Deemschutz to make his decisions about where he wants to go, and then the Ripper is again using his instincts to sneak out through the shadowy back ways of London, and then goes on toward Mitre Square and murders Catherine Eddowes. Now again, this is somebody who is perhaps very familiar with the area, and that would just mean that Louis Deemschutz isn't an extremely suspicious individual in that scenario that's laid out by Richard Jones in The London of Jack the Ripper. And he's not talking about the innocence or guilt of Louis Deemschutz in any way in the book, to be fair. He's just saying, okay, this is something that might have happened. Something could have bothered the horse that was perhaps either visual or a sound, so to speak. But then the Ripper is going to be going to Mitre Square and murdering Catherine Eddowes. And this could be an example of the Ripper just wearing those soft slipper shoes and not making any type of real noise before attacking her. But as far as the choices that the Ripper is making, that's always bothered me. it has always bothered me on the night of September 30th, 1888, when Jack the Ripper murders Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night. Because I did an episode back in 2021 called The Murder of Long Liz Stride, and it was how, well, it was just my exposure to the crime. I'm a newcomer to Jack the Ripper, and I openly admit it. And my immediate response was, now, wait a second, is this the same killer? If you look at the murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, Liz Stride was cut across the throat, and there was a lot of blood spilling out because she had not been strangled first, and she was not mutilated. And it's almost as if the Ripper was startled, so he quickly murdered her and then took off, and then, just as I said, stuck out and then went to Mitre Square. That's what a lot of people think happened. But I really just had the immediate instinct that this was just a horrible coincidence, and I would like to explore that possibility more here on Ripper Wednesday, because that is just something that has always bothered me. And if you go back to that old episode, The Murder of Long Liz Stride, you might hear me say something like, there's perhaps a 10% chance that Liz Stride was murdered by Jack the Ripper, and that honestly was what I would have told somebody, that it was just a horrible coincidence that these two women were murdered in such a short time frame, because the crime was committed differently, and also it was really only 15 minutes before the Ripper was able to locate Catherine Eddowes, and I thought, if he could have found a victim so easily, why on earth was there any type of altercation that took place, that could have been witnessed by Israel Schwartz? Newcomer, first set of eyes on the subject, my first take on it, and I then retracted that statement. It's like, okay, I'm going to reverse it. Maybe Liz Stride doesn't have a 10% chance of being a Ripper victim. How about a 90% chance of being a victim? 90% yes, 10% no. And now ultimately I would just say that yes, I think that Long Liz Stride was murdered by Jack the Ripper, but she's actually referred to as Lucky Liz Stride in the book The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones, because she was not mutilated. And I honestly don't think that there's anything that is helpful about that. Yes, there's no gruesome crime scene photo like there is for Mary Kelly, but I mean, she was murdered, and I mean, it's not the choice of Richard Jones. He just simply says that some people called her that, Lucky Liz Stride, because she wasn't mutilated. And I don't really think that she was lucky at all. She was murdered, she was killed, and that is the ultimate response. But I would also like to point out that Richard Jones concludes the book by saying that the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, are most likely only remembered because they were killed by the Whitechapel Fiend. And it is very saddening, but it's also very shocking that that's how human history forms, that this unsolved mystery took the lives of these 5 women, maybe even 6 with Martha Tabram, and that's the reason why they have a place in history, because 4 of them were mutilated severely. But with the other forms of conclusions, Richard Jones also states multiple times that most likely we will never know the truth about who Jack the Ripper was. We will never know the truth to everybody's satisfaction. And I'm a little bit reluctant to accept that, but I think I would have to as well. I mean, there's just been too many years that have gone by, over 120 years now since the murder took place in 1888. And I think that we might not know the truth, but does that ever deter me from looking into the Ripper case? No, absolutely not. And there is a lot of material to explore for Ripper Wednesday, and it's not only theories and hypotheses, but also other books out there, such as this one, and I'm definitely going to make it a priority to purchase more books to talk to you guys about here on Black Box Online Radio. And if you want to support any of these efforts, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And as I said, I want to make it a priority. Things that are donated to BuyMeACoffee.com will be spent on true crime books to talk to you guys about. And the difference among Jack the Ripper and other unsolved serial killer mysteries, like the Zodiac Killer, is that there are so many books that are on the individual suspects. Multiple books have been written about Mary Kelly. There was even this one novel that said she took his heart, so he took hers. That's like the tagline for the novel. I repeat, novel that was written about Mary Kelly. There's a more famous book out there called The Seduction of Mary Kelly by William J. Perring that's done in 2 volumes. And then there are also books that have been written about the other individual victims. And the one about Liz Stride is, of course, coming to the top of my list. As I said, that's the true crime story that's taking my attention right now, or it gets the wheels turning, so to speak. But there are just so many things that have been written about Jack the Ripper, not only books, but also movies and miniseries and so on. And I mean, there's a fascinating one that is done by, it's called Barlow and Watt, that talks about 2 people, examining and investigating the case, and they do recreations and reenactments the inquests and as well as interrogations. And I watched the first 4 episodes of that I was discussing on the Jack the Ripper report back when I was calling Ripper Wednesday the Jack the Ripper report. I'm going to get back to that one as well. But overall, I think though that there are some things with the Ripper case that surprised me, and these things in comparison to the Zodiac Killer mystery are worth noting, because this is getting away from the book The London of Jack the Ripper in some ways. But with the Zodiac Killer case, nothing is consistent. You might have 2 eyewitness sightings of a 5-foot perpetrator, one from Mike Michaud at Blue Rock Springs and one from the Robbins kids, but the Zodiac was also estimated to have been 5 feet 10 inches tall, 6 feet tall, 6 foot or better, something to that effect. Whereas the witnesses that I stated, and these are just the ones that got locked in my memory because they're all in line, are so saying, yeah, 5'5", 5'6", 30 to 35 years old, all of that seems consistent. So, I mean, that does indicate that there could highly likely have been a single perpetrator. I would like to move on to discussing the letters that were written by Jack the Ripper, because in the book The London of Jack the Ripper, each of the main letters are given some time and attention. One of them is the Dear Boss letter, and then there's the Saucy Jackie postcard, and both of these are thought to have come from the same killer, and it's written and reported in the book that most likely they are from the same killer. There are lots of similarities. But then we get to Jack the Ripper's perhaps most bizarre and intriguing letter, the From Hell letter, which was mailed to George Lusk, who was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. And in the book The London of Jack the Ripper, there are some different types of opinions that are shared. One of them is that some people thought that this was a hoax at the time. Other people thought that the letter was authentic. The reason why this letter is so horrific is because it's the one that was mailed with a portion of a kidney. About half a kidney was cut and placed into some type of alcoholic solution, and it was sent to George Lusk, and it had some type of foul smell. And originally he thought it was a prank, but other people thought that it was authentic and it actually came from the killer. Now, there are people whom I've talked about before on the channel, such as Dr. Sedgwick Saunders, who simply said that they are uncertain about whether or not the kidney was from even a man or a woman. But there's another individual that I haven't talked about too much in regards to his medical observations, and his name is Dr. Thomas Openshaw. And he goes on to become the recipient of his own Jack the Ripper letter, or possible letter. And Dr. Thomas Openshaw more or less made the conclusions that all they can say is that it was the kidney of an adult human on the left side. And then the Openshaw letter would say, you were right, Dr. Openshaw, the kidney was from the left side. What was the left side, old boss, or something to that effect. And I think the Openshaw letter is just a piss-poor imitation of the From Hell letter. I don't think it came from the killer at all. But multiple times in the London of Jack the Ripper, people are saying that they think that the letter is authentic, and then people are challenging that with skepticism, saying this was most likely a prank that was concocted by medical students, or that a medical student had access to the kidney and they cut it in half and they mailed it in. Now, some evidence that would go against that would be that the kidney appeared to have come from somebody who wasn't dead for an extremely long amount of time, which might match up with Catherine Eddowes. But some other points that Richard Jones does challenge is this common belief that there was an artery that was in the kidney that matched up perfectly to the kidney of Catherine Eddowes, and he more or less dismisses that as either some type of misinformation, or perhaps it's siding with Dr. Openshaw, that the only thing that they were able to say is that it was a kidney from an adult female, and that this this thing about determining the gender would have been impossible because DNA testing did not exist in 1888. So that's the ultimate conclusion. And if any letter is authentic, I think that it would be the From Hell letter, but with the other two, I think that the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were written by somebody else, but they were hoaxes. Just my take on the subject. But if you have anything that you would like to share about the Jack the Ripper letters, you can put them in the comment section down below. Also, what do you think about the suspects that I've mentioned? Aaron Kosminski, Charles Lechmere, Louis Deemschutz, and even George Hutchinson goes on to become a suspect. And if you would like to read the book, it is called The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones, available for free online. You can download it for free, and also feel free to go through some of the links in the description box. That's all for me now. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there. Until next time.